let me say just for 2 minutes what would be needed to move from where we are to where we say we want to be, which is net zero by mid-century. At a technical level, there's a fairly clear pathway of what is needed. And part of it is moderately well known, some of it is much less well known. So the part that's moderately well known is the energy sector transition, uh, meaning especially the move to zero carbon electricity and electrification of transport and buildings and part of industry, and the use of green electricity to produce green hydrogen for some other difficult to electrify sectors of the economy, such as heavy freight over land and heavy ocean freight and metallurgy in the industrial sector. So the roadmap to the energy transformation is analytically moderately clear. The part that is much less clear is the land use and agriculture transformation, which is perhaps, according to many estimates, around 30% of total greenhouse emissions, partly carbon, but also a lot of methane in the agriculture sector, livestock and rice production, and also nitrous oxide, especially from fertilizer use and some other chemical applications in agriculture. And what to do about agriculture is a lot harder because there isn't one farm system. There are hundreds of farm systems, a lot very undercapitalized, many hundreds of millions of people still essentially in subsistence agriculture, many problems on land use, and many fewer instruments and transformative designs in the works. On energy, there's a very good model that the International Energy Agency has published for the last couple of years on a roadmap to 2050 for decarbonizing energy, but there is no comparable roadmap to 2050 to decarbonize, as it were, the farm sector and the land use sector. And so I would say on the what to do, we're maybe 60% of the way to having sorted out the basic pathways. I would also add that governments are far behind the academic community in understanding how to turn those pathways into actual public investment policies and overall energy strategies. Very few countries have policy roadmaps to 2050. Many of them have 2050 commitments. Many academic and interagency studies show how this can be done conceptually, but very little of this is embedded in public policies yet in most of the world. And that's partly because while there are hundreds of studies of what these pathways look like, most governments do not have detailed pathways to decarbonization. And it's something that they ought to have, because it's impossible to do this without analytical structure and without basically a planning and policy framework. So that's one side of things, is that there's some moderate clarity of what to do. There is much less action, in fact, and there are a number of reasons for that. One is that the what to do is not normal politics almost anywhere. It requires longer term planning, longer term policy, new governance structures within countries that take the energy transformation outside of the day-to-day politics in some way. And that's part of this. Another part, of course, is vested interests within almost all fossil fuel producing countries, and the United States is a prime example of that. If you have a lot of fossil fuels, there is a very strong lobbying and political pressure, often just straight out corruption or government dependency on the revenues of fossil fuels that make it hard for governments to move. So the action is stronger in the places bereft of fossil fuels. That's a large part of the world. And Europe is a good example of a region that is moving quite far on decarbonization because Europe is blessed to have very few fossil fuels left. And because it is therefore dependent on importing fossil fuels rather than producing them domestically, there's less rearguard pressures on change, less domestic lobbying, and fewer options for continuing to rely on the fossil fuel sector. And the war in Ukraine and the cutoff of Russian energy probably for Europe accelerates this process. So that's the second issue. A third issue that's very deep and very structural is that good energy system solutions generally require multi-country cooperation, because to build a low carbon power system, it really helps to have a large geography of many different kinds of renewable energy assets being fed into a common electricity pool. And that's because of the intermittency of the renewable energy. A larger geographic basin for renewable energy in an interconnected grid is better, but that means multi-country energy systems, and we lack the intelligence, the cross-border trust, the freedom of investment to actually pull that off in most places in the world. So countries are, to the extent that they're trying to decarbonize, are mainly doing it nation by nation rather than in regional groups, with Europe again being a partial exception to this. But in other regions of the world, it's almost straight national policies rather than regional interconnected policies. And when you think about places like Egypt, where we are right now, or the Gulf countries, which have a tremendous solar potential, they would develop that solar energy much faster if they could export it to Europe. But there is no reliable, open access to the European power market. In fact, maybe the opposite. And so the failures of the regional solutions is quite palpable. And then there's one final point that I think is essential for the developing countries, and that is the lack of adequate finance to actually pull off the energy transformation. There are three kinds of climate finance that are debated and that each require an answer. One is this transformative investment part, very capital intensive, rather expensive, and every country needs access to long-term capital in order to be able to invest in a low carbon energy system. But well over half the world's population is in countries that lack access to the needed capital. So that's one kind of financial issue. The other two are the costs of adapting to climate change, for example, building flood control measures or water storage measures in drought regions, or resilient infrastructure that can withstand stronger storms or more flooding. And the second is responding to disasters, which are coming with greater frequency, the so-called losses and damages agenda. So in summary, mitigation, adaptation, and losses and damages finance are the three main parts of the financing puzzle, and they're all radically underfinanced. And if there's one message from developing countries in the COP negotiations is show us the money. And there's different kinds of pools of funding that would be appropriate for these different categories. In my view, the adaptation and losses and damages should be paid heavily according to historical responsibility, whereas the mitigation should basically be financed by long-term, low-interest loans. And the fact is, on all three categories, the amount of actual financing available to developing countries is a tiny fraction, maybe a fifth or a tenth of what would actually make the difference. And there are no breakthroughs right now. There are small incremental steps of greater financing, but no great breakthroughs. And one of the great disappointments in all of this is the United States government, because the US government remains at the center of financing structures like the World Bank, and the US political system is completely uninterested and unmotivated to actually finance solutions in developing countries almost entirely, except maybe a little bit to say we do it too in response to China's financing. So other than that, we don't have real solutions. And John Kerry, the US envoy on climate, is here to tout voluntary carbon markets, which is ridiculous, as a systemic answer to the financing issues. This is not going to be financed through voluntary carbon markets. And it's very sad that the world's largest economy, the world's largest historical emitter, comes to the COP with no answers in hand. And that's a big sign of how the world doesn't function properly right now. If it were a war, the United States might find the financing. But if it's only something as incidental and insignificant as climate change, it's just not worth it to the US Congress. This is, I'm being facetious, of course, but this is the strange reality of our country. So to conclude, lots of solutions, lots of demonstrations, lots of activity, lots of interesting discussion, lots of engagement all over the world, much advanced compared to 10 years ago in terms of a global mindset and interest groups and solution space, but still very far behind what would be a real scaled solution to all of this. And where we have the missing features are the geopolitical heft of major countries and the geopolitical cooperation needed to bring to the table real solutions for financing. Let me stop there, and we have a few minutes for questions. And I see some questions, so maybe I'll call Ray Jin first.